guys, we'll just wait a minute for people to get in here. All right, 2, 4, 6 of you so far. All right, just on the chat, if you can just let me know if you can hear me. Let's try this here. Let's turn that on. Oh, good. Okay, I saw a response from Jenny. Okay, awesome. How's everyone doing? Just give me a thumbs up or good or whatever or bad or... You guys doing okay? Been better? Yeah, me too, Carly. Absolutely. This sucks. Okay, so just a little bit of a rundown of what's going on and what's going to happen. So just today you had a blood typing and blood test assignment that was due at noon, or that is due at noon today. So make sure you get that in. You also will have a quiz. So I haven't built it yet, so I haven't linked it to Moodle yet, but it will be there. And I'll put on my Google Calendar, I will also put a link there for it, but it will be on Moodle. And that quiz will be on blood vessels. So the booklet on blood vessels and the booklet on blood. So both of those booklets. Okay. We're going to start something totally new today. So we're going to talk about circulation. And your quiz will not be on what's on this booklet. And I'm not going to give you any worksheets on this booklet at all, because I want you guys to just study those two booklets. I know for the quizzes, it seems like doing open book is the easiest way. And it is. It's good to have that, but it's also good to study so things are a little bit fresher in your mind as well. Okay. Any questions about what's coming up? Just a couple other things. So report cards, we still have report card marks. Just wanted to look here. We still have report card marks that are coming out. So my marks are due on Monday. So the 2 credits that have been awarded so far are the credit for the health foundations. So you guys got a credit for that, and then a credit for first aid. So those 2 credits are being awarded. And then there is the one that we're in right now, which is the cardiovascular system. Okay, so that one we're still in the middle of, so that credit hasn't been awarded yet. If you have a situation where you missed writing a quiz and the quiz is closed, please email me. Just one second here. Oh, okay. Jason just sent me a message. Yes, that's fine, Jason. I will write that down so I know what you're saying here. Not sure what's going on with the... There we go. So if you do miss a quiz, because there's a million reasons why you might miss a quiz, just send me an email so I can open the quiz up for you to take it. Okay, because I don't want to give out zeros. That's not the whole point of this. The point is for you guys to learn a little bit about the cardiovascular system. Okay. So any questions, concerns, if you're worried about handing something in or anything like that, please send me an email. The whole point of all of this is not to cause you a bunch of stress. If you get a 0 for not handing something in, know that you can still hand it in. The 0 is just kind of a placeholder until I get it, okay? So please understand that. One other thing, I did have a situation where I got an exact copy of someone's answers from 2 separate people. Exactly the same. Same font, same mistake, same everything. Don't do that. That's cheating, okay? And that does result in a 0, okay? I understand that some people are going to be sharing answers or talking about answers, but exactly the same is totally not cool, okay? All right, so we are going to start off, or we're going to start talking about circulation. So I'm just going to share my PowerPoint with you guys. So this has been uploaded on Google Classroom. And again, the video recording of this session is also going to be on Google Classroom as well. So this will be in the folder under cardiovascular system, and I have a new folder in there now that's going to be called circulation. Okay. All right. So let me. Another thing I wanted to point out, because report card marks are coming up, they have frozen or disabled your marks, so you can't see your marks right now while teachers are tweaking things, because there's a few new things that we have to do with our marks as a result of the remote learning. So just understand that, and probably by the end of next week, you'll have an option to see your marks again. Okay, so just so you're aware of that. All right. Okay, let us move on. So we'll go through about half of this PowerPoint today, and then we'll finish the other half on Monday. And circulation. So what we're going to talk about here is capillaries. So our first section is all about how material is exchanged in the capillaries. And there's really three factors that we look at with capillary exchange. And the first one's diffusion. Okay, so let's just take a look at our capillaries that we have here. And I'll just bring up my little spotlight. Okay, so capillaries are the only blood vessels that are used for the exchange of materials. Okay, so here's my capillary. And again, we have a really nice image about how it's only one cell thick. So we see these little cells, and they're flat as a pancake, but they have their little nucleus in them. And we see that material, and this image is showing me material coming out of the capillary, right? But we also have material that's going into the capillaries. So there's an in and out. So we see between the cells, there's these little gaps or slits that allows for the diffusion of materials in and out of the capillary. Okay, so we want to remember capillaries, if I think of my hands as being cells, there's little gaps between them, little gaps between my fingers. So capillaries tend to be leaky. There's some that aren't. There's capillaries in our brain that aren't very leaky, and there's capillaries leading to the placenta when a woman's pregnant that aren't very leaky. But for the most part, they're pretty leaky, so it allows a lot of exchange of material. Okay, so these are the blood vessels that are used for material exchange. All right, so we have two places really that we focus on where material gets exchanged. So let's just highlight these two places in this image, and then we'll move on and kind of talk in more detail about each of them. Okay, so if I look at the left side here of the image, in the left side, what I'm seeing is what's going on with our body cells and our capillaries, right? So here's the capillary, and here's our body cells. And what we can see happening is the oxygen is leaving the red blood cell and going into the cell, and the carbon dioxide is leaving the cell and going into the capillary. Okay, so we have this gas exchange that's happening. And then when we look at this image, we see how that red blood in the capillary network is now turning into blue blood because it's becoming deoxygenated. Understanding that deoxygenated blood is not in fact blue, right? But that's how we illustrate it, just to so we can see it and model it and understand it a little bit better. Okay, just one second, guys. All right, if we look at the right side of this image, what we see on the right side is what's coming from the lungs. So in our lungs, we have tubes, and then every little tube, so these little tubes are called bronchioles, and every tube ends in this whole bunch of little bubbles. They're almost like little balloons, and they're called alveoli, okay? Now, a single alveoli is called an alveolus. So this is one alveolus, and around each one is this network of capillaries, and that's where that exchange happens of gases. So here we're looking at what's going on in the lungs. So here, this is the alveolus. So that's one of those balloon-like structures, teeny, teeny, tiny inside the lungs. And we see how the oxygen, so we breathe in oxygen, so we inhale, that's going to go through our windpipe and go through all the tubes into the bronchioles and then into the alveoli, right? So that's where the oxygen's going to be. The oxygen's going to go from the alveoli into the capillary where it's going to bind to the hemoglobin on the red blood cell. The carbon dioxide that's hanging out in the capillary, that's the waste product that's given off by our cells, that's going to go into the alveoli. So now it's in our lungs and we breathe it out. Okay, So that's the gas exchange that's happening in those two areas. So we're just going to forward the slide, and we're going to look in more detail of the lungs first, and then we'll look in more detail at what's going on in our body cells. Okay, so the first term we need to understand, and this is the first thing that's really important when we talk about material exchange with the capillaries, and this is a word called diffusion. So you guys all know this word because you've learned about it in grade 8 and grade 9 and grade 10. Diffusion is when materials move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So this is fundamental when we think about gas exchange, right? So the oxygen is going to move from the alveoli to the capillary because there's lots and lots of oxygen in the alveoli because we just breathe in, and there's not very much in the capillary. So it's going to move into the capillary. If I talk about the lungs, there's lots and lots of carbon dioxide in the capillary because that's a waste product that the body cells gave off. Not very much in the alveoli. So the carbon dioxide is going to go from the high concentration in the capillary to the lower concentration in the alveoli. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about with diffusion, moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. All right, so if we take a look at what's going on in our lungs, okay, so here we have our lungs. We see the little tubes that are going to the alveoli. Those are called bronchioles, but that's not in our curriculum for this course. And there's the alveoli. All right. So we see that the oxygen is coming in, and they're showing carbon dioxide is blue. Carbon dioxide is going out. So the oxygen is coming in, and we see the capillaries. So the alveoli is just surrounded by this whole network of capillaries. And there's the oxygen coming in, being collected by the blood cells. And there's the carbon dioxide going out, right? And then it's entering the alveoli, and then we can exhale it. Okay. All right, so the alveoli, small little balloon-like structures in the lungs that are surrounded by a capillary network. And if I look at this image here on the side, here I see my capillary network. Here's the pulmonary arteriole. So the pulmonary arteriole is a branch from the pulmonary artery. Okay, so it's a branch of the pulmonary artery. Okay, the pulmonary venule, that's where the blood is exiting, is going to merge eventually to form the pulmonary vein. Okay, so all of the pulmonary venules that are coming off of each capillary network around each alveoli, they're all going to merge together to become the pulmonary vein. Now, just a quick reminder here, where does the blood from the pulmonary veins enter the heart? What chamber? Come on, guys. What chamber does the blood from the pulmonary vein enter the heart? I think 9:15, you guys are still sleeping. All right, the pulmonary, thank you, Jenny. The pulmonary vein enters the heart into the left atrium. Thank you very much. Okay, so the blood from the pulmonary vein goes into the left atrium of the heart. All right, so alveoli surrounded by a capillary network. Okay, so that's going on in our lungs. Oxygen in the alveoli diffuses into the capillaries where the blood is now oxygenated, right? So we see that that's going on in our image here. Okay, so we see the blood is becoming oxygenated as that oxygen's diffusing into the capillaries. Carbon dioxide from the capillaries diffuses into the alveoli where that carbon dioxide can be exhaled. Okay, because if I think about the alveoli here, right, carbon dioxide's going in. This is the bronchiole, that's the tube of the lungs, and that carbon dioxide is going to go through that tube, back through the bigger tubes, through my windpipe, so I can exhale it. Okay. All right. So now we're going to look at what's going on with the body cells. So with the body cells, we see that exchange happening here. We see that our red blood cells, they're dropping the oxygen off to the body cells. Okay, so that's what's going on here. And again, this is diffusion. Okay, there's lots of oxygen here in the capillary. There's not really any oxygen here in the tissue cells, in the cells of the body. So the oxygen is going from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. There's lots of carbon dioxide in the body tissues because that's a waste product of cellular respiration. So not very much carbon dioxide here. So it's going to diffuse from its area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Okay. All right. So gas exchange at the body cells, oxygen in the capillaries diffuses into the body cells. The blood in the capillaries is now deoxygenated, okay, because the oxygen has now gone into the body cells. Carbon dioxide from the body cells diffuses into the capillaries, okay. All right. Any questions about that? So we're looking at the exchange of the gases at the body cells and the lungs. Any questions? Okay. And we will move on here. Okay, so we talked about the capillary walls and they're pretty leaky, so a lot of stuff can get in and out, but there's a couple things that can't. So one thing that can't move in and out are blood cells. So red blood cells, white blood cells, they can't get out usually, okay? So typically capillary walls are impermeable to blood cells and to plasma proteins. And there's a particular plasma protein called albumin, which is one that is kind of critical to something we're going to be talking about with osmotic pressure. Okay, so impermeable to plasma proteins in body cells in most cases. Okay, there are exceptions to the rule. We're not really going to get into the exceptions in med services. Okay, so what this means is that blood cells and plasma proteins will typically stay inside the capillaries. They won't come out. All right. So the movement of fluid inside and out of the capillary depends on a balance of two things. One's called blood pressure and one's called osmotic pressure. And osmotic pressure is something that, just based on its name here, is due to osmosis. Osmosis, okay? So osmotic pressure has to deal with osmosis. Now remember what osmosis is, that's the movement of water. Water will go to an area that's got a high solute concentration. So it'll move from an area with low solute to an area with high solute. Okay, so that's what osmosis is. Solute is the little stuff that's dissolved in the water. Okay, all right. So when I look at these two factors, the blood pressure and osmotic pressure, collectively we refer to that as the net pressure. Okay. When the net pressure is greater, so when we have a lot of pressure inside the capillary, we're going to see more material moving out, right? So it's kind of being pushed out because the pressure inside the capillary is higher than the pressure outside the capillary. When the net pressure, so when we balance out blood pressure and osmotic pressure, when it's not very much in the capillary, we're going to see more movement of stuff going into the capillary. Okay. All right, so blood pressure, let's talk about what that means. So when we think about blood pressure is always going to be higher at the arterial end of the capillary. Okay, why? So remember the capillary has an arterial end, right, closer to the arteries, and it's got the end, the venule end or the venous end, which is closer to the veins. Okay, why is the blood pressure higher at the arterial end than the venous end? Okay, guys, I'll give you a second to answer that. Why is blood pressure higher at the arterial end of the capillaries? Yes, it is closer to the heart. They're closer to the heart, that pumping action of the heart. So there's going to be more pressure because they're closer to that pumping action of the heart. Okay. All right. Whoops. So due to the pumping action of the heart. Osmotic pressure. So this is about osmosis. So the movement of fluid into the capillary through osmosis. Okay. And this is due to the high concentration of plasma proteins. So if we have a lot of plasma proteins more plasma proteins in our capillary than outside, which we should because plasma proteins don't go outside, then we're going to have water or fluid moving through osmosis into the capillary. Okay. Now, because we have the same amount of plasma proteins inside our capillary all the time, then we should have the same osmotic pressure all the time. Okay. But that can change. So situations where that can change. Sometimes what we can have is an allergic reaction. An allergic reaction releases something called histamines. And histamines can make your capillary more leaky to plasma proteins so they can make their way to the outside of the capillary. And that can actually reverse the osmotic pressure. And what it can end up causing is a lot of fluid between our cells. And that's where we get some swelling. So sometimes for an allergic reaction, because histamines are released often with an allergic reaction, we end up with swelling because the fluid in our capillaries is going the wrong direction. It's going in between our cells, okay, instead of staying in the capillary where it's supposed to. So we can have a disruption in where those plasma proteins are, but there's not that many situations where that happens. Okay, so if we take a look at this image, what we're looking at is a capillary, and we see the different parts of the capillary here. So we see, let's make this red here. So we have the arterial end of the capillary. So that's the one that's closest to the heart. That's where the arteries are. And we have the venous end of the capillary. So that's the one that's further away from the heart. Osmotic pressure. So that's the pressure of fluid going in due to osmosis based on how much protein we have in the capillary. That stays the same. Okay. That's only going to change if we have a change in those proteins. And like I said, there's only very few situations where that happens, and we don't have to know that for this class. But what we see here is we see a higher blood pressure. So blood pressure is pushing against the inner walls of the blood vessel, higher blood pressure over here at the arterial end because of the pumping action of the heart. And we have a lower blood pressure over here closer to the venous end because it's further away from the pumping action of the heart. So when I take account the blood pressure and the osmotic pressure, I get my net pressure. And we see that when we subtract the blood pressure from the osmotic pressure, we end up with a net pressure moving out. So we see materials moving out of the capillary. Okay. But when we get to the venous end, our net pressure is lower, and we can see the movement of materials going in to the capillary. Okay. All right. So the arterial end of the capillary, blood pressure is higher, so material diffuses out of the capillary. And in the venous end, blood pressure is lower, so material diffuses into the capillary. Okay. So that's what's working with our capillary exchange. All right. Okay. So that's talking about capillary exchange. The next thing we're going to talk about, so this is our last topic for today, is we're going to look at what affects blood flow. So how quickly blood flows through our body. Okay. So blood flow. Now in arteries, blood tends to flow quite quickly. And that's because there's higher blood pressure because it's closer to the pumping action of the heart. So we tend to have a faster blood flow. And in our veins, we have a slower blood flow because blood pressure is lower because they're further away from the direct action of the heart. Okay. And because of that lower blood pressure, that's why we need things like the skeletal muscles that are constricting around the veins to force the blood up through the vein, and then the valves. So when that skeletal muscle pushes that blood up, the valves prevent that blood from going back down again, right? So it's the action between the skeletal muscles contracting and the one-way valves that have that blood moving through the veins because of that lack of pressure. All right, so what resists blood flow? So there's something that's referred to as peripheral resistance. So basically what that's talking about is when I think about the blood vessel and I think about blood flowing through that vessel, okay? So I have my blood flowing through the vessel, that blood's gonna go against the wall, the inner wall of the vessel. And when that blood pushes against that inner wall, there's more friction, and that friction reduces that flow. Okay, so that's what peripheral resistance is the friction's reducing the flow of blood through the blood vessel. Okay. Now we see the effects of this mainly through our smaller arteries and our arterioles. Okay. All right. So we get more. So peripheral resistance is increased if we have vasoconstriction. So we need to remember what vasoconstriction means. So we have our blood vessel, vasoconstriction to get smaller. So vasoconstriction, the muscle in the blood vessel is contracting, so we get a more narrow diameter. Okay? So this will decrease the flow of blood. So we have more resistance, right? So we're going to have less flow of blood going through there because it's on the side walls of the vessel and it's got more friction there, so the flow is not going to be as much. Okay, so why do we have vasoconstriction? Sometimes with stress. So I talked a little bit about the stress response. So for example, if we're going through a fight or flight response, our arterioles constrict where blood's going to our skin because our skin isn't important to get blood during the time of a fight or flight response. So stress will cause some of our arterioles to constrict, which will increase the peripheral resistance. If we have low blood pressure, one of our autonomic responses is to constrict our blood vessels because that increases our blood pressure, right? If our blood vessels constrict, then our blood pressure goes up. So it's a way our body has to maintain homeostasis of our blood pressure, maintain that balance. Okay, so one thing that affects peripheral resistance is vasoconstriction. Another thing is reduced elasticity. So we have to remember, like our arteries are elastic, right? Because they have to be able to allow for that bulge when the heart beats and then go back to the normal size and bulge and back to the normal size, right? So our arteries and arterioles have to be able to do that, okay? So that's elasticity. So you want to think about a rubber band. I pull the rubber band apart and then I let go of it and it goes back to its normal shape, right? That's elasticity that allows for that movement. So what happens when we get reduced elasticity? Well, if we don't have reduced if we have reduced, it doesn't expand as well when that bulge happens when the heart beats. Well, if it doesn't expand as much, that means there's going to be more blood pushing against the walls of the blood vessel, which means we get more peripheral resistance. Okay, so situations where we have less elasticity. The biggest one is old age. So as we get older, a lot of our bodies become less elastic. Um, for example, we lose elasticity in our lens of our eyes. We lose elasticity in our skin. So a young person can push their skin, it bounces back. An older person, you get a dent and it takes a while for it to come back, right? We lose elasticity. Well, we lose it also in our blood vessels. So they're less able to expand with that bulge, right? So more peripheral resistance occurs. We can also get reduced elasticity if we have a buildup of cholesterol. So if we have a high fat diet and we get a buildup of cholesterol, that makes our blood vessels so they're more solid, right? They just don't have that elasticity to be able to bulge, which also, of course, increases our peripheral resistance. Okay. The other thing that increases peripheral resistance is increased viscosity. So viscosity is a word you guys learned in grade 8, and that's referring to the thickness of a liquid. So increased viscosity of the blood. So if we have thicker blood, it's going to drag along the sides of the blood vessels more. And as it drags along, right, we have more friction, so we have more peripheral resistance. So it decreases the flow of the blood. So increased viscosity can be a result of dehydration. So we don't have enough water in our blood, so our blood gets too thick. It can be a result of a condition called polycythemia, and that means we have too many red blood cells in our blood. Okay. Either way, our blood is too thick, so that increases our peripheral resistance. All right. Peripheral resistance is also affected by blood volume. So peripheral resistance is decreased if we have less blood volume. And that makes sense. If we don't have as much blood, then there's less blood pushing against the walls of the blood vessels. So there's going to be less resistance. Okay. So we're going to see reduced blood volume, usually as a result of hemorrhage. And hemorrhage just is a fancy word for blood loss. Okay. All right. So blood pressure, when we think about blood pressure is controlled by cardiac output and peripheral resistance, right? And we've learned about cardiac output already. So cardiac output, okay, right here, cardiac output, that's our heart rate and stroke volume, okay? So let's just remind ourselves of what that is. What does it mean when we talk about stroke volume? What is that? Yeah, stroke volume is how much blood is pumped out of the heart every time the heart beats, okay? So that's stroke volume. What's heart rate? Yeah, well, heart rate is the speed. Yeah, is the speed of the beat. So how many times the heart pumps every minute? Okay, so the number of beats of the heart per minute is our heart rate. Okay, so if we multiply those, we get our cardiac output. So here's our cardiac output. And then we have the factors of peripheral resistance that we've just talked about, right? So the diameter of our blood vessels, if our blood vessels become constricted, we're going to have increased peripheral resistance. If our blood vessels become dilated, we're going to have decreased peripheral resistance. Elasticity. The less elasticity we have, the more peripheral resistance we're going to have. Viscosity. The thicker our blood, the more resistance. Blood volume. Okay, the more blood, the more resistance. The less blood, the less resistance. So when we take all of these factors together, when we take our cardiac output and peripheral resistance, if those go up, we have higher blood pressure. If those go down, we have a reduced blood pressure. Okay. Okay, we're doing good. Okay, we're going to go to the next slide here. Okay, so what do we mean when we say blood pressure? I know I've talked about it, but I wanted to find a picture here for you. Oops. So when we're talking about blood pressure, this is showing an artery because arteries are really where we worry more about blood pressure. The pressure exerted by the blood, right? So what we're seeing in this picture is we're seeing the pressure that's going against the walls of the blood vessel, right? That's our blood pressure. So our blood pressure is higher when it's pushing against those walls of the blood vessel more, lower when it's pushing less. So if we think about blood pressure, that's not what I wanted to do here. There we go. When we think about blood pressure in our blood vessels decreases when they get further and further from the heart, right? So we're going to have the highest pressure, we're going to have our highest pressure in the vena cava, or sorry, in the aorta, right? Because we want to remember that the chamber that forces the blood into the aorta has a lot of muscle. Can you remind me what that chamber is called again? Okay. That chamber that forces blood into the aorta has a lot of muscle. What do we call that chamber? Thanks, Ethan. The left ventricle. So that chamber is called the left ventricle. That's what's pushing the blood into the aorta when it contracts. Left ventricle. Ventricle. Ooh, not spelling that very well. Okay, so that's the aorta. Now, then we have the least amount of pressure is the vena cava. That's the furthest away from the beating of the heart. Okay. Now, if we think about, here we go, where we have the highest and lowest pressure in the different parts of our body, right? Our highest pressure, when we look at this diagram, is in the aorta. The next highest pressure that we can see in this diagram is in the pulmonary artery, right? Because that's an artery that's coming directly from the heart. A lower pressure than that is going to be coming back from the lungs. And then in this diagram, our lowest pressure is in the vena cava. Okay. And yeah, that was all I wanted to do today. So next class, we're going to talk about blood pressure, and we're going to talk a little bit about how we measure it. If we were in class, we would be using the blood pressure cuffs. We obviously don't have that opportunity, but I do have a couple links that we're going to work through to simulate the use of blood pressure cuffs, so we get at least the sense for how they work. And then we're going to look a little bit about some health conditions associated with blood pressure, and then talk a little bit about pulse. Okay, so you have a worksheet that's due today at noon, and that's on blood typing and blood testing. You have a test that starts on Monday, and that test is on blood vessels. So that booklet on blood vessels and the booklet on blood. So that's your test on Monday, and I'll open it from Monday to Wednesday. So before we sign off for the Friday, any questions? Okay, I don't see any questions. So everyone have a wonderful weekend. And if you think of any questions, the one we did Wednesday, Ethan, is already posted. And this one will be posted as well. Yeah, absolutely, they'll be posted. It's in the blood vessel folder of the cardiovascular system. Any other questions? Yeah, so this one will be posted at some point before 5 for sure. All right, have yourselves a wonderful weekend, and we will talk to you guys on Monday.